Hello everyone, it's Jerry here. So this week on the blog we're trying something slightly different. Rather than give you a piece of reading to do to extend your knowledge about constructivism, or prescribe a particular change, particular theory that you might try out in your classroom, actually instead what we're going to do is we're going to take on this theory of constructivist learning and we're going to use it as a lens to see if we can understand our students and where they're at in the learning process a bit more deeply. So the format this is going to take is we're going to ask you to interview your students in a constructivist way, right? So specifically looking to elicit from them what kind of sense they're actually making of their learning this year. So seeing how they're constructing their understanding both of the content that we're teaching them and also, what sense they're making of their role as a learner. What sort of strategies, what sort of techniques, what sort of responsibilities they might have within that process. So before we get started with the format of that interview, what it might look like, I think it's useful to just quickly recap on what this idea of constructivism actually is. Now, by this point in the course, you'll probably have covered a couple of different theorists, at least, and started to see how constructivism might be applied directly in the classroom, whether that's through the ideas of cognitive conflict, or scaffolding, or spiral curricula. We're not so much worried about those. We're actually, for the purpose of this interview, we just need to get our heads around constructivism as a general way of looking at the learning process. And the underlying premise of constructivist learning, of what a constructivist would view learning as, is that the generation of knowledge and making meaning, making sense of that knowledge happens through the interaction of the external world and our internal worlds. So as human beings, naturally, when we go about the learning process, this kind of happens through having experiences, through being directly involved with the world, through doing things, and then internalizing, forming ideas, forming concepts, maybe starting to form rules from those experiences. So thinking about cause and effect, thinking about what works, what doesn't, and then all of that internal knowledge that we generate will then, whether consciously or unconsciously, come to inform and direct future experiences through our behaviours, through what we do in the world. So to a constructivist thinker, actually, the act of being human is to be involved in a constant learning process where we have a dialogue between the external world and our kind of ever shifting and ever changing internal reality. What they would also agree is that that isn't a passive process. It's one where we have to actively think, actively kind of analyze and process the external world, right? So the knowledge that we build up kind of becomes ever more complex as we feed new experiences, new pieces of knowledge and skill into what we already know. And over time, we form more and more complex constructs or schemas about the world and about particular topics. So particularly looking at learning, as a tutor with your particular subject, you'll have a much more rich and complex understanding of your subject than your students. And hopefully through going through the process of their learning this year in the module, they will be learning new things and they'll be slotting it into what they know, and they will be forming their own particular construct, their particular piece of kind of knowledge architecture. And I think it's a really helpful approach as teachers to start working out what that looks like in our students, to try and get it out of their heads and visible in the room, so we can see kind of what's working and what's not working so well, what they might need to swap in and out in order to be most successful in their learning journey. The other thing that's tremendously important to a constructivist is, because there's this dialogue between inner and outer worlds, actually that pre-existing inner world, our own histories and experiences, our own future expectations of learning, they're tremendously important. So kind of beyond just thinking about what people already know, what particular styles of learning they have, all of those other nuances and idiosyncrasies, they're very, very important in the learning process to people individually, because we need to be able to effectively relate new experiences that are incoming and slot them in an effective way to what we already know. And of course, we need to have effective strategies for making those things work to us. So that's constructivism in a nutshell. And as I said, hopefully this interview process gives us an opportunity to get that mental structure, to find out some of those particular nuances of our learners, their histories, their expectations, their self-strategies, out of their heads and into the conversation, into the open, because then we can work with them in a slightly more attuned way. So fundamentally, within this interview, we're looking into two specific questions. So firstly, we want to find out what sense our students have made of the content within the module, within the subject this year. So get an understanding of their learning, of what new information, new skills they have, what they've understood, in what ways have they understood or maybe misunderstood it. And then also we want a bit more information about how they've understood the process of their own learning. So as I said, who they feel they are in the learning process, what kind of responsibility or autonomy they have, whether that relates to kind of group learning or independent study, what kind of strategies they think might be effective or required. And I think, often as teachers, we get an awful lot of information back about this first question, whether that's through, doing things in the room or formative or kind of the end summative assessments. We're very focused on what students have understood and whether it's right or wrong or better or worse. But actually, I think it's far less common that we take the time to get inside our students' roles and expectations of the process of learning. So one of the reasons we're doing this interview, I think we've got three things that we're going to be working on. Firstly, I think this helps us develop some slightly higher order listening skills, the skills of interviewing, developing good questions. Because if we're really focused on eliciting not just what they know, but what sense they have of what they know, getting a whole picture, a whole system out of their head and into dialogue, that's actually quite a more troublesome thing to do. And I think a very advantageous skill to have. We're also going to be linking the findings that we get from our students back to key ideas that we've studied on the PG set. Now, knowing PGO2, the module is all about linking theory and practice. So in a way, rather than linking theory particularly to what we do in the classroom, we're refining the skill to link our students' learning, to link strategies they might have back to kind of key ideas and concepts. So it's further shortening that distance between big ideas and how they actually work in the real world. And the other thing is that if we're careful about this and you choose your topic carefully, you might get some really useful and usable data that you could use towards your actual research project. So in a way, this might help you both towards Module 2 and also further your research for Module 3. Now, in terms of setting up the interview, really you can do this in lots of different ways. So I'll let you approach it in quite a broad way. You know your students, you know your topic, but there are a few particular rules that kind of help the process ease along. So do set up the space, get some time, make sure that you're adequately in a private environment, in a positive environment. where you can talk in some detail about a very specific thing. So I would say at least 2 or 3 students, excuse me, will get you the most amount of benefit from this task. With one student, you kind of run the risk of just going into their particular world and their interpretation. So I think to be truly critical and use this in an informed way, just kind of get outside of one perspective. And of course, you could do this interview one-on-one with 2 students, or you could do it all as a group. And I think there are some benefits to that as well. Now, I do think it's useful to isolate a very specific aspect of the curriculum or of what you do in your kind of learning role with them. So you could think about an individual lesson they've had, a specific activity you've used in class, or you might talk about a particular skill, particular theme of the content, or as I said, you might isolate it to do with one specific thing to do with your action research project. So do think carefully about which you choose, because I think if you pick something overly broad, then you run the risk of not getting very much interesting information. It can be very easy for people to bounce all over the shop and not really give you as much detail as you need. So, further to this, as I said, you could do the interview as a group. And actually, this can give you quite a lot of benefits. If you set it up so that students are aware that it's safe to disagree, you're not looking for them to have some kind of groupthink or collective hive mind, then students might bounce back and forward. They might challenge each other. The act of hearing another student talk about their experiences in the particular topic, that might further them. It might kind of help them reflect and unlock some new and interesting things. And as I said, yeah, you do need to set it up in a way that is actually safe and okay for them to disagree, but that does tend to be helpful. And also, yeah, you do need to make it very clear that actually this is completely participatory. So if you recall back to all of the ethics work that you've done within your research projects already, of course, it's completely fine for students to drop out. You would hope that signing up to the interview, they'd be aware of this already. And actually, you do need to think a bit carefully about how you're going to record and capture the useful data you're going to get from the interview. Now, of course, you do need students' consent if you actually want to do an audio recording. Now, we've got consent forms. They were, or example consent forms that you might have to tweak a little bit. They were appended to the original ethical consent form document. The ethical approval PDF, that should be up on the blog. You should have been using that with your research project already. But there are a couple of other ways of doing it if you don't want to go down that road. Doing an audio recording is nice because you get everything and you can be more fully involved in the conversation yourself, but certainly you don't have to go down that road. Taking notes and being present within the interview as you're taking notes is obviously a little bit trickier than, say, observing a lesson where you're very separate. So do think about the way that you run this before you're actually in there in the interview. I might suggest capturing very quick notes, kind of key points, maybe specific quotes from students during the interview. And, just get down from them specific key points of what they're giving to you. And then I'd say you want to review those notes as quickly as you can after the interview and get down all of your thoughts or kind of fill it out in a bit more detail. So one approach that I tend to use and that tends to work is actually just to separate 2 sides of a page of A4 in a journal. And I take the whole right-hand column for any notes during the interview, specifically the data I'm getting back. As I said, key themes, or not key themes, but key details and specifics, and potentially quotes. And then on the left hand, I'll capture all of my particular thoughts and reflections. So say if I'm spotting themes, or if I've got any particular views, maybe ideas or theories that link to it, because it's really helpful to separate those out. You wouldn't believe how easy it is to sit down, say, a week after the interview and actually really be quite muddled up about what's your interpretation and what's your thinking and what the student said specifically. So be aware of not putting yourself too much into that whole process. So as I said, you can approach this interview really in any way that you like. You've got professional discretion. You know what you're trying to find out. You're trying to get how they're constructing an understanding of the topic and their role as learners. You've chosen the topic. Really, you can go free. You can pre-write questions. You can go in there and be happy working a bit more intuitively, just kind of follow things up and have a fluid conversation. And of course, you can do a bit of both. But as a starter, there are a few questions that tend to be quite effective. So you might want to ask about specifically how they've approached particular tasks. You might want to think about getting from them what existing knowledge or understanding they've drawn on in the topic in the class. Think about what other resources or existing skills they've used or built upon. Maybe how and why they decided to adopt particular strategies or pursue certain interesting ideas. And see if you can find what difficulties, what challenges they faced in the learning process. That might tell you an awful lot. Maybe think about what helped them in tackling those tasks or overcoming particular difficulties. What might have made it easier for themselves. What they thought the point of the task was. So again, maybe think about their process as a learner, trying to interpret and understand what you're doing as the teacher. Maybe ask about how well they think they did in the task or the module, and on what basis they're making that judgment. Right? If they think they're successful or not successful as a learner, it can be really helpful to try and work out why they think that is. Often students have quite a different view of what it means to be a good student, what it takes to be successful at degree level. Brilliant. So you've done your interview, hypothetically. You've talked to your students, you've gathered some interesting data. Now just going to show you what we're going to do on the blog in order to process that in the way that we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to form a 4-part report process, right? So we're going to develop this over time. We're going to address one of these questions now, and we're going to come back to it at later points on the blog in the coming weeks. But what you'll hopefully end up with is a report structure that will be systematic, hopefully be a bit critical in approaching what you've done and what you've found from a few different angles, and it might actually give you both the content and, as I say, the structure, so that you could use that directly, perhaps within your action research, or maybe as a kind of appendix to your PGO2 essay. So the way this report is going to run, firstly, just account for what you learned from that interview, about your students' approaches to their learning, their understanding, how they're constructing and making sense of everything. Secondly, take a step back, an analysis of those findings, particularly explaining how they relate to the literature. So for us, this is going to be your own reading about your practice, whether that's direct methods that you've used that students were thinking about, and whether they were successful or not, whether that matches up with the theory, or maybe it's to kind of wider explanatory models and frameworks. That's completely up to you. Thirdly, think about what implications these findings and that analysis might have for your students' future learning and or for your teaching and development in the future. And then finally, to really refine some of these skills directly transferable for your research project, considering the methods that you used within this interview and maybe following and interpreting the data from that interview, how effective, how appropriate do you think those methods were, right? So starting to think a bit about methods, methodology, what makes a better or a worse method for generating data, for looking at data, maybe starting to think about potential biases that might come into the room or into the interview. You know, maybe thinking about differences of opinion or the ways that you've structured or framed questions, the way silence was held. You know, I think that lots of different things could go into this. But starting to step back and get a bit evaluative of not just your process and your role as a teacher, but your role as a researcher as well. So that's it as the overall structure. All we have to do this week, because that's an awful lot, right? That's an awful lot of very deep and useful thinking, and far too much for 1 week on the blog. So right now, all we need to do is for you to find 2 or 3 students, conduct the interview, and then we'll be posting up an account of what you learnt, right? So that's this week's blog. Just summarise, try not to interpret so much, but summarise both the data from your students and maybe a little bit about what you think that means. Cool. That's it for now. Take care and I'll see you soon.